The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the chair of the Capital Markets Subcommittee, Ms. Wagner, for leading our committee Republicans' capital formation agenda on the House Financial Services Committee. She's done a fantastic job. And I want to thank members of the minority party for joining with us in passing some of these important bills. And today we'll pass, by the end of the day, 11 of those bills through the House of Representatives in the last 2 weeks. So I want to thank members for their work there. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 2608. This bill clarifies the periods for which financial statements are required to be provided by an emerging growth company. Now, an emerging growth company is an important provision of the Jobs Act in 2012. These are smaller companies that are growing rapidly, and the idea here is we wanted them to be able to access the public markets more quickly. Now, let me stop here. Now, it is a real pleasure to spend time on the House floor getting back to the policy that I am most steeped in and most interested in, and quite frankly, thrilled that I'm not talking about the debt ceiling. So thank you for begging my indulgence there. But this important provision of the Jobs Act, called the Emerging Growth Company piece of the Jobs Act, has this designation for an IPO on-ramp. Now, the idea here was these are smaller revenue companies, and those revenues would, in their growth, we wanted them to be able to get to the public markets as quickly as we can. And so emerging growth companies are given a 5-year ramping period in the public markets to comply with a lot of regulatory requirements that public companies are obligated to comply with. The goal here was to have an accommodation to have more companies go public here in the United States, and it's worked. And this was Title I of the Jobs Act. The success of this provision was as a direct result of it being self-executed. We wrote the law, and instantly that day people started using the statute. Within the first 2 years of enactment of the Jobs Act, emerging growth companies represented 85% of all U.S. IPOs. And additionally, this specific accommodation for 2 years of audited financial statements was utilized by 65% of emerging growth companies within the first 2 years of the Jobs Act. But despite the success of the Jobs Act IPO on-ramp, there are clarifications Congress should make to maximize the utility of these provisions. For example, there are instances where an emerging growth company or a company that qualifies as such during its initial public offering must provide financial statements for periods earlier than 2 years. The first instance is when emerging growth companies acquire a significant business. The emerging growth companies must present 3 years of financial statements, even though the post-merge company also qualifies as an emerging growth company. Well, this is kind of a wonky bit in failure of the statute. The second instance is when a company qualifies as an emerging growth company during its IPO, but later tries to conduct a follow-on offering to raise capital after it loses its emerging growth company status. In such instances, the company would also be required to provide 3 years of financial statements. So this bill updates emerging growth company financial reporting accommodation to clarify that emerging growth companies, as well as any company that qualifies as such when it is conducting its initial public offering, does not need to provide audited financial statements for a period earlier than 2 years, which is required during the emerging growth company's initial public offering. All right, that's a lot of words. This update will increase efficiency by ensuring that these companies will consistently and will be able to consistently rely on the Jobs Act's scaled financial reporting requirement accommodations. It will eliminate an aberrational result that actually have been shown to require burdensome and unnecessary financial reporting obligations. This bill clearly establishes that an emerging growth company will not be required to provide audited financial statements for any period earlier than 2 years, including in those instances I mentioned that were not previously addressed in the original Jobs Act. So 11 years of the Jobs Act and this particular section of the Jobs Act have shown that they're wonderfully successful. We have more IPOs using this statute than any other change in securities laws we've made as a Congress in recent memory. That is a great success. But we want to update that existing statute, and we're doing so in a bipartisan way, and that should be a welcome sign for Congress, that we can do complicated things and we can do it in a bipartisan way, and that's what we're here to do. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes, and I yield back the balance of my time.